Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the penultimate session of the conference. We appreciate everyone for hanging on here. The name of the session that we're going to be on today is called The Great eBook Exodus, Navigating Ownership versus Access in the Post-Purchase Era. My name is Matthew Rigucci. I'm the Director of Institutional Marketing at Wiley. I'm joined by John Elwell, who is the Senior Vice President of Books over at EBSCO. And I'm also joined by Randon Heiser-Miller, the Associate Dean of Collections and Discovery and Digital Initiatives at San Diego State University. So we're going to actually kind of diverge from the straight stand and deliver style presentations that I'm sure you've seen a lot of this week, and do more of an informal panel conversation as well. We do have a few questions to kind of guide the conversations here. So for those of you who were expecting the kind of stand and deliver stuff, I'm sorry, but those of you who like more of the informal vibe, especially as we kind of wind down the conference here, you're welcome. So we chose a little bit of a provocative title, I think, here with the term Exodus. We're not going to solve all the problems, I think, that exist in the industry, but we do want to acknowledge that there's been some changes, some disruptions. A major aggregator has decided to sunset their perpetual purchase model. There have been shutdowns like Baker & Taylor. There have been acquisitions like Carter just this week. So there's a lot going on in our industry, and it's sort of really the purpose of our conversation is to have a thoughtful discussion, convening the panel from each of the stakeholder groups here. You've got a librarian, you've got an aggregator, you've got a publisher, although I should note that John and myself are also librarians by pedigree, so technically we're all librarians. But yeah, I mean, just making sure that we're covering the different stakeholder perspectives in this very challenging, ever-changing landscape around purchasing and what perpetual access means. So I'm just going to pose a few questions to the group, and I think we'll go ahead and get this kicked off. So the first one is kind of more philosophical, I think, and thought-provoking. We're not going to have like a monologue on on copyright and all of that, but we did want to kind of talk about what the concepts of ownership and access mean to you. So Randon, would you like to kick us off with your opinion?
Sure. My name is Randon Heiser-Miller. I am the Associate Dean for Collections, Discovery, and Digital Initiatives at San Diego State University. I've been there just over a year now in that position, and it is a new AD position for that institution. I'm going to just start by sort of talking about the reaction that we had at our institution when the news came out that the aggregator was going to jettison perpetual access of eBook, and sort of go through our mindset and what kind of disruption that caused for us internally. We were working towards becoming a Rialto institution. We were trying to get our liaison librarians off of Gobi in a not as completely, but we were trying to strategize, and especially with ebooks, because it made it easier to upload them into our LMS if we used Rialto. So this really put a stop to that immediately. The other questions we had were, if you have e-content and it's not on a server you own, do you own it? I think it's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I think you do. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later. But the immediate reaction from my librarians was, you have to get that. You have to get our content out, and you have to put it on a server. And I was like, well, that's a great solution. The problem is, we don't have a server that will hold it, that you can still have access to, because we can't pay for that. We have a centralized IT model, and we are working towards a model where we are paying into server space. And right now the quote that we have is $300,000 a year to hold our website alone. So the idea that we're going to suddenly pull all of our e-content onto a server that we own is just not practical. It's not going to happen. We could put it in a blob situation, but then you have no access to it, which makes it pointless. The next question that I had was, and I think most of us in this room, there are librarians that work with collections, very small amount of my budget goes towards monographs or ebooks. 90% of it goes towards continuing resources that is tied up in that with inflation attached. And I don't know why in God's name I would ever put the last 5% into that kind of situation. And I think that from a practical sense, right? When we talk about budget cuts, when we talk about cash liquidity, that's the only place I can go and immediately be able to cut if it's a budget that comes down in the spring, which in California is something that happens, right? You're told last minute that you're going to have to cut this because the budget isn't coming through. So that was my hard take, was in a system where we have increasing amounts of money being tied up in agreements that we can't get out of easily. I don't know that it makes sense for us as institutions to go in and add subscription to that last piece. I think as a company, it makes sense for certain vendors to want to do that, because that is good cash that comes in. I've been saying this a lot, and I think it has some within the system and the situation we're in currently. You know, things are going to have to be different. There's just no way that we're going to continue the ecosystem that we had. And I think that sometimes we are still stuck in this 1990s mindset where cash is just coming into higher education and we can just pay for these things, and that's not going to be the reality. I don't think. I'm not trying to be a pessimist. I just think we have to be cognizant of that. The other question we had was, who is going to be curating these ebook collections? One thing that happened when this announcement came out was also that the collections librarians were let go. So who is going to be curating this collection, and do I want it? And we still want to have access and well, not access, but ownership over what we actually are getting in those access subscription models of ebooks. And then I think the last piece of this is, I think we can see as a country, as an economy, we are moving much more. I mean, I know in my personal life, everything is leased, right? Like, I don't own my iTunes anymore. I have that leased to me, and that kind of thing. And I see that as like what we're sort of moving to, and I don't know how far that goes. And maybe this is an inflection point for that, but I definitely think for libraries, I want to use this as an inflection point for our collections and really decide if that is something we want to continue to do. There are things that I think we should only have access to. I think there are things we absolutely should own, and I think that's going to be different for every institution. The main thing is we need to have that option and not be sort of pigeonholed into one or the other. So there's where I'm at.
I feel like this is a good time for me to jump in. I think it's very critical. There is no ownership without access. There's no access without ownership. What do I mean when I say that? The entire sustainability of the book ecosystem is on the back of perpetual purchase books, both print and digital. That's what's paying for all of the infrastructure that goes behind everything. So that's what goes back to the publisher. That's how the publisher creates more content. That's how more content gets into the system. All of the infrastructure that supports those systems, that all comes through the perpetual book chain. Now, access is critically important, right, because it supports additional usage of the content. It supports much larger content pools. Right, we know digital books are much more expensive than print monographs, but it's important to understand that the economics really do play a huge role here. So they have to be linked together because they sustain each other. The other point that I'll make is when we look at perpetual books, I would argue that there's not much more perpetual than an ebook, right? There's not much more tangible ownership than that. If you say, okay, I have a book on an EBSCO or a Wiley or a JSTOR or any of those platforms, your institution is going to have access to that book in perpetuity. If one of the large institutions, an EBSCO or a Wiley, went out, one of the other vendors, right, there's language that they'd be able to pick that up. That happened with Dawson in the UK when they closed. Those books were all supported. No one lost access on that. If those went down, other aggregators could step up. Then there's even there's archives that then would supply the actual content if all of that stuff fell apart. So there is real value in the ownership of the book, right? You don't have to worry about being stolen or lost or damaged. Think about the PDFs that you bought a few years ago as ebooks. They're now available as accessible EPUBs. You get those automatically. That support is there. You don't want to have that on your own server. It's not worth it. We want to take advantage of the economy of scale that's provided by accessing these. So to me, it's really good value, but understanding that the ownership and the access go together. They support each other intrinsically, and that's really critical in this. That's how the whole book ecosystem works and stays sustainable.
Thank you, John. For my part, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the infrastructure piece, because I think that's kind of important. The digital space, I think, is fundamentally different from print. There's always dependencies. right? And you just discussed quite a few of them. I think, I always kind of viewed this concept of ownership as more of like a contractual agreement that you'll have access to that content because you've purchased it in perpetuity. Libraries don't really have usually don't have the bits and bytes and are storing this content the same way that the publishers and the vendors are as well, and there is a cost to that as well. And I think that's kind of part of why we're having this conversation now is an evolution of the market, right? And we're going to talk about the different models in just a minute. But I think that what we're seeing is not just pure, I'm going to use the R word and say revenue and profitability and cash flow and all of that. That's certainly a part of the conversation. But really, it is about making sure that there's sustainable models for supporting the infrastructure that has to go into place to support this content and to make it better. But it's not just for publishers, it's for libraries too. A print book, like you said, there are things that can happen to it, but at least it is kind of like a set it and I purchased it, it is done. With e-resources, it's quite different. That I was talking about the infrastructure piece, but also the work that librarians have to do to kind of stand up and make sure that that content remains accessible. There is a cost to that as well. That's going to be a consistent theme throughout my answers is what is it costing us? Because, Randon, you touched on this earlier, and we could have conversations about capitalism and socialism, all day. But, for the publisher vendor part, it really is about creating predictable revenue streams to support operations, but also to do it in a way that isn't going to, to break the backs of our customer partners as well. This isn't like just raising the rent. That there's, I think that there are some reasons behind this. So with that, I think maybe we can jump over, and we talked more about the theoretical, I think, about ownership, but maybe we can talk more about the practical and what is currently in practice in the market and what we're seeing. And I think, John, I would like to start with you because you're an expert in the different models that EBSCO and that just currently exist in the market. So can you talk about the different access models and how they're represented and run us through this? And I think we have a visual here for you.
Yeah, and we can just pull the quick visual up. And this is a very loose, high level. And when we start looking through Gobi, right, there's tons of different ways to acquire monograph content, right? The print is very much still relevant. There's been a couple of really good sessions this week that have talked about the value of print still. But if we look at that, right, perpetual access is still a critical piece of this, right? That could be in bulk as in e-collections or title by title or approval. We look at stuff that is demand driven, right? The user or the patron drives it. Could be DDA, could be EBA, those kind of metric-based acquisition models. So all of this kind of plays together in the acquisition strategy of how you can acquire content. Now, it's not straightforward. When you look at the print side, it's fairly easy, right? It's hardcover, right? Paperback. The digital is way more complex, right? You'll have multiple price points, you'll have multiple acquisition, there's duplication control, right? It gets complicated. But when we were talking about this earlier and was really interesting, is a lot of it's seamless, right? A lot of it happens really quick in the back end. You don't realize how those feeds connect everything together in what's going on. So again, this really becomes a major infrastructure piece to me when we talk about acquisition and access. Around ebooks in particular, that infrastructure has to be strong to keep it sustainable and allow us to continue to generate new content. A lot of sessions have talked about the concept of like bibliodiversity and finding more content, finding new content, right? Finding stuff that is less easy to discover. And I think that's really, really important. That's critical. But it needs specific channels, right? You're not going to necessarily see a ton of use out of a small publisher that's distributed by somebody like Asterism who might publish 3 books a year, right? It's going to be hard to drive usage globally on something like that. But that research, that novel content is really important and might be really discoverable even if only 3 libraries acquire it. So it's the value of that infrastructure that allows that information to surface up. And there's a lot of ways to do that. And open access takes advantage of these commercial channels as well, right? All of that infrastructure that open access books is using today, that's the commercial underpinnings. So it really does matter how all that flows.
I can go. I think I just add really quickly to this. For me, when we're talking about these models as a collectionist coming from that strategy sort of mindset, evidence-based were always sort of what I went to. And I'll just give an example with Gobi. When I was at Colorado State, we use perpetual purchases to inform EBAs. So as far as like going to the publisher directly. And Gobi did a good job of that. So we had a Taylor and Francis. One year we spent like $80,000 buying individual Taylor and Francis titles. So we went to Taylor and Francis because my Gobi rep was like, you should go to them and say, we'll pay you this money and see what they do. And they did. They gave us access to their entire corpus for $80,000, and then let us keep a third of that as perpetual access at the end, so they turn into an EBA. And for me, that is sort of the sweet spot of I can gain all of this access. It was over 1 million volumes that we added to our collection, and then still get to make decisions on what I want to perpetually purchase and own based on usage and other constraints. But I don't have to limit what I'm putting in my collection by just what is being requested, and it's also not based on discipline, because I think we can get in this whole conversation of how different academic disciplines use things in different ways. So my point is I really want choice, and I want ownership of the libraries to be able to have that, and I think if you move to a subscription-based only, or any of these, and I think you were talking about this a little bit, we want to be able to be agile and make those decisions on a local level and not be sort of dictated to. And I think when you get into a subscription only, you have less option at a local level.
Yeah, and I mean, I found this graphic really helpful, John, putting this together and sort of where they each of them sit on the spectrum, because I've always seen evidence-based acquisition as kind of the happy medium. I mean, and it's it is kind of a subscription model to a degree, because you are paying for this year on year for broad access. But at the same time, you're also hedging your bets by making data-driven decisions to build your collections, right? But I think what we're seeing on our side is that there is a very much pun intended shelf life to this model. Because at the end of the day, the libraries, they're able to build their collections to the point where they're only, they know the content that is being used. And larger content providers and publishers have the luxury of producing new content at scale to continue providing value. But we see that that well is kind of running dry over time. So we're also looking at ways of creating revenue stability, revenue streams, and it's a challenge, because we know that this is a difficult time. I mean, that's the other thing I think that's the elephant in the room, is reconciling all of this is incredibly challenging. That we have certainly the vendor point of view, but this is a time where budgets for libraries are at best stagnant, but most likely declining. So how do we meet that middle ground? I thought that EBA was a great example of evolution in the market, and maybe if we have the sort of the ape to man sort of chart of evolution over time, where we are, it's going that way, that we're evolving over time. But yeah, I kind of thought of EBA as kind of sitting in the middle, because it is something quite different.
And I think the key is that each library is going to have a different collection strategy. And this is where that, again, going back to the idea of ownership and access, there's different places for each of these. Right? There's going to be some institutions where EBA makes total sense. There's going to be some where it's DDA and perpetual. There's some that's going to continue to be print heavy and only order digital when they need to. So it's understanding that all of it's supporting the same ecosystem and infrastructure, and making it available so that there's choice there, right? And that's what we've talked about this whole, as we've been prepping for this, is the idea of, okay, each library knows what they need to collect better than anyone else. So how do we facilitate that in a way that makes it easy, but also makes it sustainable and gets the money back into the ecosystem to drive new content and more access to models? So it really plays well together, and the three of us, I think, are the three pieces of it that are most critical.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I'd also add that in addition to the models, that there are different channels, right? And that there are pros and cons to both. I think that with direct from a content provider, you get the flexibility, you get the negotiation, you get a little bit of tender love and care, I think. But again, there is a cost to that, because you have to negotiate, and not all institutions, like you're saying, providing that choice, not all institutions have the luxury of being able to directly negotiate with a publisher just for books. So we have these aggregator models that provide that convenience, but there is a cost to that too, for that convenience as well. But again, in the name of choice. And we really haven't talked too much about these sort of like mega models. I think we've been kind of alluding to them, like ProQuest eBooks and Academic Complete as well. And it's something that you mentioned earlier, Randon. And what I might be a little bit concerned about is the concentration of market power and what I call the Disney Plus problem. So Disney Plus, their strategy was to get folks in at a lower subscription cost to gain your dollar, to get you, I don't want to say hooked on it, but certainly my family and our children were we're very much Disney Plus goers, and so when the price starts raising, we almost feel like we're stuck. And like you were saying, Randon, I mean, like, who owns anything anymore? It's so much easier to have an iTunes, a Spotify, a Netflix subscription, but when you get locked in, where you have nowhere else to go, and then the prices start rising, like, what happens then?
No, and I think, I was just thinking that is a perfect example of, I think, my fear for libraries is that we get in these subscription models and then we cannot sustain that long term. And I know that, we're talking now a little bit about that inflection point or that pain point between nonprofit entities that are universities and corporations that need to make money. And it's interesting to me because I feel like there has slowly been a shift since I've been a librarian to less, and I'm saying this in a generalist term, and it doesn't mean that's every vendor or every publisher, but there's less of that acknowledgement, and more of we need to continue to create money and revenue stream. And I think what I would like to see, and I think what a lot of my colleagues felt sort of offended by with the decision to go with the subscription model for ebooks, is that consideration seemed to not be there, right, for like what the libraries were experiencing or what they needed and what they're actually going through, and that understanding that there is that pain point between, yes, I understand as a vendor you need to make money, you need to like be able to support this model, but that has to be within reason. And I don't know what that is, right, and I'm not trying to say that I do, but I think that there has to be a give and take in that, and locking libraries into a subscription model is not sustainable in the long term.
So on the topic of models, and I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, but talking about the specific opportunities and challenges that exist with the models, and what's on all of our minds, I think I'd actually like to start with this. So I'll start with the good or potentially good opportunities. I'm putting my marketing hat on right now, and it's I think that if prices are going to rise, then providers have an obligation to create value-added services, and not just things that are developed in a vacuum, but features and functionality that libraries and their end users want, right? We're seeing a lot of AI development. This wouldn't be a Charleston session if I didn't mention AI, but there's a lot of vendors and publishers out there who are adding that functionality, right? What I would argue is that there needs to be consultation with customers, on the product side, because just to put something out there, right? And I think that we will see that. I think that, and that is a responsibility in addition to just the bare bones infrastructure and the systems that we're supporting just to keep the content live, although we do have to talk digital preservation at some point in this conversation, or at least I want to talk about it. It is to make it better, right? To make this content more engaging. So I think that that's a potential opportunity, with some of the models that are trying to increase maybe the prices. But there is a workflow complexity problem. And are there any e-journal, e-resource librarians in the room? Can I just see a show of hands if there's any of you, a few of you, right? For journals specifically. And so you all know as well as I do, e-resource management is like incredibly complex for something like journals. They're changing publishers all the time. They're changing their names, their titles, their ISSN. There's metadata, there's linking concerns. It's very complex. And so when we're talking about things like an access model or subscription model, not supporting one-time purchases, essentially what we're doing, and I'm going to talk about what this diagram is, I feel like I haven't addressed it yet, is a lot more work, cost, again, on institutions. And while maybe cost will be lower for unprecedented size and mega collections, there is work that the institutions are going to have to do. And this brings me to the diagram. So when I first started at Wiley, my main job was to demystify the MARC records and bibliographic records process for our ebook content. And what I learned is that we work with a vendor, OCLC. It was very complex, even just for a straight purchase. But then an added layer of complexity, I'm sorry, I'm talking about EBA again, but is how do we tell libraries how to get the records that they need for perpetual access? How do they make that distinction versus the titles that maybe when they do decide to retire their EBA program, that they want to purge from their systems? And we do have a response. If we're providing the records, we should provide some sort of guidance on how to do that as well. So I developed this, which is kind of like a labyrinth here. I'm a very visual learner, but it's sort of like, how do I get to the green part? And it's like just 12 easy steps. You can get there. And yeah, I mean, it is just I guess it might be just like an artifact to show that, even for these sort of ephemeral subscription type of models, that the back-end work is incredibly complex. And I'm just talking about bibliographic records. I mean, there's other things that the libraries have to do in order to stand this stuff up. And when they become not permanent, there is more work that goes with that, and I did want to acknowledge that. But either of you, I mean, potential opportunities or challenges with some of these models?
I do think that for libraries that I've worked in, and thanks for the diagram about e-resources, because I think we were talking earlier, and some of the reaction that we had to this this was also because we're applying physical monographic logic to ebooks, and that is not correct. Because they're not. And we need ebooks, because I am a firm believer that students today at our universities are using them more and more, and they are not. Unfortunately, I'm so sorry, the physical collection is not being touched. And it's not because it's not valuable. It's because the way we disseminate and use information is completely different than it was even 5 years ago. I have a friend that has a kid 23 years old, and what he does is he downloads the ebook and he does a keyword search and he finds what he needs and he moves on. And unfortunately, if the library doesn't have it immediately, he goes and pulls it from a BitTorrent. That's how it goes. And I think that what you're talking about, this labor that libraries do not have the infrastructure, at least the ones I've worked at. We don't have the people, the manpower to do it, because the erroneous assumption is if it becomes it's easier, and that is completely backwards of the reality of it. And no matter who you argue to, they don't really believe that. But I think that we need to think about those things as well. Outside of a subscription-only model, which obviously I'm not for, I do think there is value with the aggregators and publishers and the work they do with the ebooks that we're not able to do. I mean, I think we have to admit that, and accessibility is a very big thing, and it should be. But libraries don't have the infrastructure to go through and make an ebook accessible or meet those new standards that are being sent down. And also, if we don't have that, we don't have the ability to make sure that we have the most up-to-date, current version of that book in those ways. So I want to acknowledge that, this isn't all publishers are bad or something like that. I think there's value there. I think it's deciding what that is and what value we need from those vendor partners as we go through these shifts in how we collect. And also challenging librarians not to approach ebooks in the same way they do monographs, because that's just not the ability. That's not how it works, essentially. And it's way more complicated than I think what we give it credit for, essentially.
And I always find this conference really heartening, because as I'm sitting in multiple sessions, and it kind of really bookends nice with this being the last series of sessions, the conference, but getting to listen to everyone talk about this, 99% of the time we're aligned with the problems we're trying to solve. All of us are thinking and trying to figure out how to reach these same things. A lot of the times we're not doing it at scale because each of us are different pieces of it, but seeing us try to problem solve these, and one of the things that I appreciate most about it is there's a long-term commitment to do all of this, right? We're focused on solving this in perpetuity. How do we make this work not in the next 6 months, the next 8 months, the next 12 months? That's really important too. But we can take a longer view. How do we make it sustainable for the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years? And that's critical here. To me, that's the opportunity that we're looking at, is we're saying, okay, these institutions, the libraries aren't really going anywhere, right? Most of the publishing houses, right? Most of the mission-driven presses, they're here to stay. That's their goal, right? The vendors in the space, we're not moving. So how do we solve this in the long term? How do we make this a sustainable ecosystem moving forward? And I know I keep saying infrastructure, but to me that's what it is, right? We need to take advantage of our economies of scale, and we need to figure out how we do things quick and easy, right? For an affordable cost that then gets back to the people creating the content. It's very, again, circular, right? The libraries, the librarians, the researchers, those are the people using and generating the content, right? It all comes back to that piece. And everything around that has to be supported. So it's just, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and we're at kind of an inflection point with everything that's been happening, with all the news that Matthew alluded to, with everything that's been happening the last months, to really evaluate this and figure out how do we do this, not just 6 months from now, but 6 years from now and 10 years from now.
Yeah, sure. So I think you touched on a little bit of this just now, John, but what is sustainable for all of the stakeholders involved? We have about 10 minutes left, so put the shot clock on now, but yeah.
I'm not sure I have a clear answer. I mean, I think that I've alluded to the need for help from our vendor partners and publishers and aggregators, and how we manage these collections, ebooks, and how we make them discoverable and usable to our communities. That's what I think our universities. And I also think we still need to have control of what those collections are at the local level. Let libraries be able to have choice in how they sustain this, right? Because as we know, we're all different in this room. All of our universities are different. We have different budgets, different needs, and we need to be able to have that ability to make those decisions on a local level. But I think there's a lot of pain points within this process, and maybe this situation is one where we can start talking honestly about the kind of help we need in libraries, and also asserting some of that independence in the process to make sure that we can get through. But I know that budgets are going to be constrained, right? And we need to make sure that we're getting the greatest value for what we're putting into these publishers and aggregators and resources.
Yeah, to me, we all made a decision to do what we do, right? None of us said, hey, like, I didn't go get an MLIS and my wife's an academic public. Like, we love books. Like, that's what we do, right? And the passion that everyone feels, right? Everyone, as we're in these conferences and people get really fired up about things, right? I walked into a meeting the other day and they're like, wow, you're really hot today. And I was like, I care. I really do. And I know these guys do. And I know everyone out there, like, the passion about what we do is so important. And that's just so optimistic to me from a sustainability standpoint. Like, we really care and the effort is there. And if we just keep working at it, we'll figure out how to get these into sustainable channels and keep that infrastructure going to make sure we have the content we need moving forward. And that's what's so important to me. It's just the passion that comes out of these that everyone has in this workflow. We'll get there. And I feel like we're really moving in the right direction, and we're making huge strides about how to be more efficient, how to take advantage of the economies of scale that we have, how to leverage existing logistics. So I feel like we're really moving in the right direction, and it gets me excited for this time.
Okay, I guess I'll have the final word here before we move to questions. But I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with the things that both of you had just said. And I saw a sign earlier this week that says, as long as you have breath, you draw breath, you have hope. And I am hopeful, because I do believe this might be my kumbaya moment, but that the things that that we're working towards, and the number of things that unite us, I think outnumber the things that ultimately divide us. We all want the same thing. We all want scholarly content in the hands of users. I think we have different means of doing that, but I think that there's space in which we come together, and reconciling that, again, the demand for revenue, meeting declining budgets, is a difficult thing to reconcile. Perpetual only models are facing declining returns. That is the reality. But at the same time, we can't create this sort of, what I'm calling the Disney problem, but the streaming sort of mentality of, essentially rent raising, because that is also not sustainable. So what is the middle ground. And I think the three of us kind of came into this conversation, agreeing we don't have the answer. We don't have some panacea that's going to solve all of this. And so I'd argue that, it demands a shared sacrifice across the ecosystem. That's publishers, that's aggregators too. That we can't really create models that our customers can't pay for. I think that the concept of moving to access is fundamentally changes the dynamic for libraries, or is contrary to the mission of libraries, which is at least part of the mission is the preservation piece. If you don't own anything anymore and something happens, like John mentioned, there are safeguards in place. We've got good old clocks in Portico out there as well. But yeah, I mean, again, it's sort of what do we, I don't want to end with a question, but it is what do we own and where is that going? I feel like the hybrid approaches, like the evidence-based acquisition model, is a nice example of of reconciliation and trying to meet the needs of both vendors and libraries. But I think that will ultimately, over time, have to be replaced with something else. And I agree that I don't think subscription is the only way forward. And for those of us who are participating in that, we do have an obligation to make it better then. If you're going to raise the rent, you must make this a little bit better for everyone, or provide value-added services that are going to be used. So we have about 4 minutes left. Are there any questions in the audience? Oh, shoot, I forgot to share your diagram. Sorry about that.
If you want to know what infrastructure looks like, it's that. But please, if anyone has any questions.